Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into a really profound philosophical text that, well, it systematically lays out an argument for the existence of the soul. You know, a consciousness that exists beyond our physical bodies. Okay, let's jump right in. The source material kicks things off by challenging our most basic assumption, that reality is just what we can perceive. It asks us to consider a pretty wild idea. What if our senses aren't these perfect windows to the world, but are actually more like carefully calibrated filters? So the whole core of this first argument is that our reality is so much broader than what our five senses are even equipped to detect. We're not seeing the full picture at all. It's more like we're peeking at it through a very, very narrow keyhole. Now, what's so fascinating about this is how it really shows you just how small that keyhole is. Our eyes only see this tiny sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum. We're totally blind to the infrared beam from a remote control or the ultraviolet patterns that guide a bee to a flower. And our ears? They're completely deaf to the ultrasonic world of bats or the deep infrasonic rumbles that elephants feel. These signals aren't imaginary. They're a real fundamental part of reality. The point is, our biology just isn't built to register them, and this suggests that a thing's existence doesn't depend on our ability to perceive it. So the crucial point the text is making here is that we should approach a concept like the soul with this kind of intellectual humility. This quote, it's not just some nice saying, it's basically a proposed rule for how to think about these things. It suggests that outright disbelief, just because something is beyond our sensory reach, is just as uncritical as blind faith. And with that framework of open analysis, the text starts to build its core model of consciousness. All right, let's move on and see how this framework defines the very nature of our being. The source proposes that our consciousness isn't some single, simple thing, but that it actually operates in two very distinct states, or modes. First up, we have what's called the Jit-Yan, or the spirit essence. This is described as the fundamental, unchanging reality of our being. It's the pure awareness that exists before thought, before sensation. You can kind of think of it as the silent, formless source of life itself, timeless and totally serene.
And this concept is illustrated brilliantly with a parable. A father tells his son to cut open a fig, and then to cut open one of its tiny seeds. "What do you see inside?" he asks. The son looks closely and says, "Nothing." And the father explains that this unseen nothingness is the very essence, the life principle that allows a massive tree to grow. The Jit-Yan is just like that. It's the invisible, powerful core of our being.
Now, in contrast to that, there's the Yin-Yan, or the karmic consciousness. So if Jit-Yan is the silent source, Yin-Yan is the active experience. It's the part of our consciousness that's engaged with the world through our body. It's the I that sees, hears, wants things, and thinks. It's totally conditioned by our senses and our actions. And according to the text, it's this state of consciousness that carries the imprint of karma. Okay, now this is the key. The source argues these aren't two different souls fighting for control of you. Nope. They are one single essence, just in two possible states, kind of like water. Water's true nature is H2O, right? That's the Jit-Yan. But if you add heat or cold, the conditions of the physical world, it becomes steam or ice. That's the Yin-Yan. So in this analogy, an enlightened state is when your consciousness is just resting in its true nature, like pure water. A diluted state is when it's conditioned by the senses, either frozen into the solid form of an ego or scattered like the steam of passing thoughts.
So now that we have this whole philosophical framework, this idea of a pure essence versus a sensory consciousness, let's get into the anecdotal evidence the text presents for a consciousness that can exist totally independent of the body. The source organizes its evidence into these 6 main categories. It suggests that all these phenomena, from something as common as having a premonition in a dream to extraordinary claims of recalling a past life, all point to the Yin-Yan operating beyond the physical limits of a brain.
And while the text touches on all 6 of these categories, it really zeroes in on one case as its cornerstone piece of evidence, the story of an Indian boy named Toran Singh. This was a case of past life recall that was actually investigated by a professor from the University of Delhi. Let's walk through this story because it's pretty incredible. It all started when Toran Singh, at just 2.5 years old, insisted his real name was Suresh Verma. He claimed he'd owned a radio shop in a city called Agra and that he was killed by a gunshot to the head. Well, his brother eventually traveled to Agra and found that the story was shockingly true. There was a radio shop, a widow named Uma, and her husband Suresh, who had been murdered exactly as the boy described. So Uma the widow came to visit the boy. He correctly identified his sons from his previous life, he recounted private details that only the couple could have known, and he even pointed out a new display case in the shop that wasn't there before. But the final piece of evidence was the most striking. An autopsy report confirmed that Suresh Verma's fatal wound was to the head. Torn Singh was born with a very distinct birthmark in the exact same spot.
So after laying out this whole philosophy of a dual-state consciousness and then presenting this kind of detailed evidence, what's the ultimate conclusion? What's the big takeaway from this perspective?
The crucial point of the source material is really this. It reframes the entire purpose of living. If we accept the premise, then our body isn't who we are. It's more like a temporary instrument, a vehicle. And the goal then is to use this physical experience, this life, to purify our awareness and reconnect with our timeless, essential nature, the Jit-Yan. And that leaves us with a final question to really chew on. Does all this evidence suggest that consciousness uses the body as a kind of temporary vessel? Or are these phenomena simply complex, powerful stories our brains construct to make sense of the profound mystery of our own existence? Thank you for joining this explainer.